1988, on that day, the phone at the police station started ringing. First a woman called, "Hurry up, we're having a nightmare." Then a man called, "Hurry up, we're waiting, we've been murdered." Then even a teenager called, "Some uncle has been stabbed," and all the calls came from Littleville Township. The detectives didn't understand, multiple victims or just a lot of witnesses. They rushed to the scene of the emergency and caught a small group of residents of the settlement. They were all standing in the meadow, away from the man lying there, afraid to approach. The picture was truly frightening. Unbelievable brutality. And the strange thing is, they didn't try to hide the body. They left it on display for the whole village to see. Bad man. Normally, you feel sorry for the victim. But the locals didn't seem to be feeling too bad about it. He deserved it. What is this? A show execution? Maybe everyone knows the killer, too. I didn't see anything. Well, I do. Dozens of wounds. The perpetrator was probably enraged. In that case, this tragedy is the result of a long and persistent feud. That's what the detectives thought, and they were wrong. Wyoming detectives have launched a brutal murder investigation in Littleville Township. A knife-wielding man was found in a prominent meadow. There were a lot of wounds, yes. And most importantly, they were all shallow. Someone had just abused the body. The victim was quickly identified. 42-year-old Drake Township resident. Disabled since childhood. Who would kill a helpless and defenseless man? The detectives learned Drake's story. From childhood to his 40s, his fellow villagers felt sorry for him. Kind, feeble-minded, harmless. Always went everywhere with his mom by the hand. But last year the woman fell ill after a stroke, and Drake went off the chain. At first Drake dragged hung laundry or chickens, and everyone tolerated. But recently he grabbed a little girl and dragged her away. At the noise the girl's father, Yvonne, ran out and grabbed an axe. Drake resentfully threw down his prey and threatened to kill him. No one took his threat seriously. But that same night, the invalid came for revenge. The door of the house was not locked at night, so Drake entered the room, grabbed the girl's father by the leg and yanked him off the bed. Noise, screams, panic. And in the midst of this bedlam ran Drake. From that night the unfortunate girl began to stammer, and her father vowed to punish the offender, had he carried out his threat. The detectives went to Yvonne. Yvonne confessed, yes, he wanted to kill him. He had his heart set on killing the idiot. But when he went into Drake's house, he was stunned. Drake was gently combing the hair of a tiny, dried-up old lady. "I gave Mom a bath. Steaming hot, Mom." The woman began to praise her son. "He's doing such a good job taking care of me." Mom didn't know her son was stealing. But he did everything just for her. He was not going to hurt the girl, he just carried her to the house. Mom loves little children. "Do you love me?" Evan was embarrassed. And the next day, Drake was murdered. The detectives had no idea what a difficult job they were about to undertake. The settlement was tightly packed with houses and cottages, and the detectives knew they had their work cut out for them. They needed to question every single resident. Who among them could have committed the murder? The list of possible suspects filled several pages. As the investigation went on, the detectives started narrowing down their search. Eventually, they were left with just one name, Alex, a 23-year-old who had only recently moved to the village. Turns out, Drake, the murder victim, was his cousin. They uncovered a key piece of evidence. Alex had been seen washing his shirt in the river at dawn that morning. Why would that matter? Well, it looked like he might have been trying to wash away some incriminating evidence. They brought Alex in for questioning. He seemed genuinely surprised and asked, "Why would I kill my cousin?" But the detectives searched his place anyway and found the shirt he had washed. The shirt had brown stains that looked suspiciously like dried blood. Convinced they had their man, the detectives arrested Alex and sent the shirt off for testing. But the odd details didn't stop there. A clear shoe print was found on Drake's thigh, the imprint of the killer's footwear. When they checked Alex's shoes, they found he owned a pair of sneakers with fluted soles, just like the print on the body. They waited for forensic results, confident that they'd be able to prove Alex's guilt. On the third day, the forensic report came back. The brown stains on the shirt weren't blood after all. Then, the report on the shoes came in. There was no match between Alex's soles and the footprint on Drake's body. Alex was released immediately, and the detectives were back to square one. They had to start their investigation from scratch, and this new development completely turned their case upside down. The investigation into the murder of the disabled man dragged on for a full year. The detectives were at a standstill, with no new evidence or suspects to work with. By 1989, in the settlement of Lindsborg, a new case emerged. Early one morning, workers arrived at a construction site, entered the trailer, and found their co-worker Nick lying on the floor with his head smashed in. The walls of the trailer and the surrounding area were splattered with blood. It was a gruesome scene. The detectives learned that the night before, the workers had been hanging out in the trailer, drinking and having a good time. Nick's boss, John, had been the last person with him. Could this upstanding, well-respected man have attacked one of his own workers? The detectives decided to investigate. They brought John back to the blood-soaked trailer, hoping the crime scene might rattle him enough to reveal something. What they didn't expect was for this big, strong man to suddenly faint at the sight. It quickly became clear that John was squeamish, terrified of blood, and couldn't possibly have committed such a brutal crime. The detectives pressed on with their investigation into Nick's murder. Before long, they found the murder weapon, a piece of pipe with brown stains that looked like blood, along with some hair. There were no fingerprints on the pipe, leading them to believe the crime had been a spur-of-the-moment act. That night, only two people had been at the construction site, Nick in the trailer and the night watchman at the gatehouse. They called the watchman in for questioning, and to their surprise, it turned out to be none other than Alex, the same guy who had been a suspect a year earlier in the murder of Drake, the village oddball. Back then, forensic evidence had cleared him of any wrongdoing. It was proven beyond doubt that he hadn't stabbed Drake. And now here he was, caught up in another bloody mess. Was this just terrible luck, or was this coincidence too strange to be accidental? 1989, Wyoming town. That afternoon, there was a knock on Merrill's apartment door. When she opened it, she was shocked to find a man lying there in bloody clothes. In the distance, she could hear the sound of footsteps fading away. The killer had stuck around just long enough to see her reaction before quietly slipping away, probably feeling smug about his own twisted sense of power. The victim was an elderly man named William. The sadistic killer had stabbed the poor man repeatedly. Experts later counted around 70 wounds on his body. It was clear the killer was escalating, using more and more force each time. He wanted people to know just how violent and dangerous he was. The investigation began with the usual routine, questioning neighbors and canvassing the area. Some reported seeing William with an unfamiliar man shortly before his death, a man with deep bald spots on his head. But despite their efforts, the detectives couldn't track down this suspicious figure. A few months later, now into 1990, another body was discovered in an unfinished house. This man, who was initially unidentified, had been stabbed 101 times. The conclusion was obvious: a maniac was on the loose, targeting men without any apparent motive, just for the sheer thrill of it. The identity of the latest victim was eventually confirmed as a man named Jack. Finding the sadistic killer took some serious legwork, but soon enough, the net began to close in. Witnesses reported seeing Jack walking down the street with a man who had those distinctive bald spots. There weren't many young men with that description in town, so the detectives checked out everyone who fit the bill. Before long, they found themselves looking at Alex once again. The key detail was that Alex always seemed to be nearby when these attacks happened, yet none of the evidence ever directly implicated him. Throughout every interrogation, Alex remained calm and confident, never getting flustered or tripping up on the facts. The detectives quickly figured out that Alex saw himself as some kind of great, yet underappreciated, figure. They realized they could use this to their advantage, playing into his need to feel like the most important man in the world. Alex wasn't physically strong or intimidating, but he was a cunning, cowardly sort of guy. That's when a well-known detective named Paul, who had a knack for getting even the most tight-lipped people to open up, was brought in. Paul managed to earn Alex's trust by praising his so-called deeds and expressing admiration. Alex had long wanted to share the tales of his great and terrible exploits, but only with someone who would truly appreciate them. Before long, Paul got the full story out of him, the tale of a mama's boy turned maniac. Alex's first crime dated back to the 5th grade when he hit a second grader in the head with a brick. It was his own mother who helped him avoid getting caught. She wasn't horrified by her son's cruelty, instead, she strictly instructed him never to tell anyone and hid the brick in her bag. Alex's mother was a respected figure in town, running a butcher shop, and she only became worried when she heard that the boy had survived. Luckily for Alex, the victim had lost his memory due to the trauma and was eventually transferred to a boarding school for mentally impaired children. The next brutal episode took place during Alex's time in the Navy, and once again, he managed to get away with it. Alex's method was always the same, he'd get offended over some trivial matter and then lash out violently at the victim. He never bothered to hide the bodies. Detective Paul couldn't help but wonder why this sadist hadn't been caught sooner. For 2 years, Alex had been killing people with impunity, not even bothering to cover his tracks. What's more, he'd been a suspect in all 4 murders, yet every case had stalled. Paul reviewed all 4 criminal cases and found that there really were no solid leads. The evidence had always pointed away from Alex, especially in the case of the handicapped man, Drake. That investigation had fallen apart because of forensic errors. Paul decided to re-examine everything himself. He didn't want to make the mistake of punishing an innocent man. What if Alex was just deluding himself and was mentally ill, rather than the killer he claimed to be? Paul decided to revisit the evidence, starting with the clothes Alex had washed after the night of the first murder, the one where Drake was killed. He carefully traced the faint drops on the fabric with a felt-tip pen and sent them back to the lab for another round of testing. This time, the results confirmed it, they were indeed bloodstains, and the blood matched Drake's. Next, Paul focused on the shoes. Earlier, the experts hadn't found any matches, but Paul wasn't satisfied with that. He tracked down the exact pair of sneakers Alex had worn and sent them to a different forensic department. Once again, the results came back, confirming that the sneaker had left a print on Drake's body. Now, Paul had everything he needed: expert conclusions, a confession from Alex, and the irrefutable evidence to back it up. It was clear that Alex's mother, who had always been there to help him cover his tracks, had played a significant role in hiding the evidence. No one doubted that the sadist would be sentenced to the death penalty. But the trial was anything but straightforward. It dragged on, with 3 different sessions, and each time the indictment was rewritten. When the verdict finally came, it shocked everyone: 15 years for the deaths of 4 innocent people. Rumor had it that Alex's mother, as twisted and rotten as her son, had hired a top-notch lawyer to defend him. In the end, 2 of the murder charges were dropped from the verdict. Alex was released in 2006. They say prison life broke him. He's not the same man who once lashed out violently at people. Now, he lives alone, with no family and no friends, just a hollow shell of the person he used to be.